Yes, welcome to the horizontal lecture, and it gives me great pleasure. Louise Stone. You will see also goes under the name Swarm Warriors. So Louise is from ANU in Australia, but she is also a very distinguished career as a medical educator, particularly in terms of training. And she has a specialist knowledge, particularly mental health, particularly with Aboriginal and Indigenous people, and also a claims fame being a flying doctor. So she has a very varied career. I have known and had the great privilege of knowing her for a number of years because of her pioneering work looking at sexual violence in the area of health, and particularly doctor violence. And now in the final stages that should be coming out this weekend. And so I know she will be drawing on some of the things there, but she will also be drawing on her very, very rich qualitative experience as a researcher. And so please put your hands together to welcome Louise Stone.
Hello, it's wonderful to be here. Nice thick Aussie accent. I come from Canberra, which is the capital no one's ever heard of. And today I wanted to do two things. I wanted to talk a little bit about being a lady doctor and what that means, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about how to use narratives to influence policy. So I've had the good fortune or misfortune or fortune of some description anyway of working in policy at every level, at national and state and local, as well as being an academic. And being a GP, I can't stay on one thing for very long. So I've tended to end up explaining concepts that are difficult for policymakers to understand. And for those of you doing public health, it's one of the difficult things is working out how to manipulate narratives to get them to do what you want. So I'm going to use some examples to talk about how we go about doing that. This presentation's in 3 sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about gender in medicine. I'm then going to talk a little bit about narratives, and then finally some stuff about sexual abuse. And I am going to spend a lot of time talking about using narratives. So the lady doctor problem goes everywhere. It happens in vets, it happens vets as in not veterans, vets as in looking after animals, and all doctors, dentists everywhere. And the way it works is that it's assumed that women are more caring, that we are more empathic and compassionate, that we listen well, that we have people skills, but also that we are self-sacrificial. Now, I'll be talking a little bit about the Australian system of how finances work, because the finances actually really matter. And I'll give you an insight into how that works. I know the doctors in the room, you think that Australian general practice is the great holy grail, but sorry, no, it's not. So in Australia and actually everywhere around the world, lady doctors, and remember that's a term that's given to us. It's not a term that we own. It's a term that is assumed. And so the community will make big assumptions about who we are and what it is that we do. We see a lot more chaos. We see a lot more preventive care, slow, complex, emotionally intensive medicine. Whereas the men tend to see lucrative, in my world, procedural medicine and a lot more highly instrumental and time efficient. And that's unfair on all genders. My GP is a male. He fits very much into the lady doctor group. He's amazing. So remember again, this is not intuitive in terms of who we are. It's who we are assumed to be. Just to make sure that we don't make that assumption that we've got some inherent capacities, because it's not true. Now I know you can read graphs, but I just wanted to show you the Australian one, and I'll helpfully put some circles around it. You can't see it on the other side, but this orange part is the mental health work. And you can see that lady doctors at the moment are doing about 20% more. It keeps going up. And if you look at women's health in green, the blokes are at 2%, we're up here at 45%. Again, that tends to be slower, more complex medicine, none of which we would mind if it wasn't actually disprivileged when it comes to time and labour. So let's have a look at that and let me explain in hopefully words of one syllable what happens with costings. But first I want to tell you a story. Has anyone heard the story of the dun cow? Maybe it isn't in Scotland. It's certainly all over England and also in Ireland. And one of the reasons I'm here is I pick up stories because stories make a difference. So here we go. Once upon a time, there was a village and the village was starving. They'd had drought for years, happens in Australia all the time. Maybe it was floods in Ireland, I don't know. But anyway, they had drought. People were dying from famine. And then one day, an old lady or a witch or a fairy, depending where you are, turns up with this enormous white cow. And the deal is that this cow will fill up any bucket with milk, providing that the family takes the bucket, carries it up the hill, milks the cow, takes it down again. One a day, that's the rules. And this goes on for ages, and actually the village does quite well. The children are fed, everything's looking swimmingly fantastic, until a witch or an evil person or someone comes and tries to milk the cow into a sieve. And they milk and milk and milk until the cow turns a dun colour and either dies or runs away. Now, for those of you working in policy, this is the story that I use about compassionate donation of time and labour. So traditionally, what happens is that we fill up the bucket with a little bit of compassionate donation of time and labour. At times when a family, I remember I lived 3 hours away. We do helicopter transports if patients are ill. And I remember a mum flying to Melbourne from where I was living at the time in a country practice with her boy who had probably meningitis. And I knew they were poor. So, you give them $20 and say, go get yourself a coffee. It's just what you do. What we're finding now, though, is that compassionate donation of time and labour is now being used as standard. And then you have nothing extra to give, and eventually you start to starve your workforce. And that's what's happening in Australia, and I believe it's also happening here. We've also got some anti-cow narratives happening overseas, so I'll tell you about those too. So when I was started as a registrar, we had these things called external clinical visits where someone, fancy would come and sit in with you and give you feedback. And at the time I was pregnant, I was setting up a women's health clinic in my town. I was doing my Masters of Public Health, there you go, and also working. And I remember the supervisor saying, you've got a time management problem. And I, for some reason, had my brain on that day and said, I don't have a time management problem. I have a complexity allocation problem. And this is true. Because I guarantee you the receptionists will look at someone with 6 children who's crying, who's poor, and go, I'll just pop you in the lady, doctor, she'll be good. And this is why we run into difficulties. Again, is it a problem? No, it's a problem because of the way that we are compensated for our work. So in Australia, it's very common that the more senior you are, the less you learn, because the less you earn, because the pay in general practice is optimised for 6 minutes, which makes it difficult. So let's see what that actually does. So this is just demonstrating that yet again, so we're looking at this lovely teal section here, and navy blue's the blokes, teal's the women. Women on average spend at least 5 minutes more with their patients than the men do, because of the work that they do. We also expend an awful lot of emotional labour. And remember that gendered expectations don't change when we go home. I'm yet to work out why is it that mothers always man the Mother's Day stalls at primary schools and the Father's Day stalls. They do. On average, again. So because of that structure, we're finding that women are burning out. So the suicide rate for female doctors is 4 times that of men, and it's 3 times that of the average woman in the Australian population. And one of the reasons is because women think they're failing. And the reason they think they're failing is because they can't cope with this. So during the pandemic, the thing that I got doing was doing an awful lot of writing. And the reason I did was because the first 5 years after you fellowed as a GP are really scary. Everything's new. Nothing feels automatic. It all feels difficult. And so what happens is those first 5 years people are often quite vulnerable, and they were leaving, burning out, stopping medicine altogether because they thought they were failing. And I ended up writing an awful lot over that time. And they would bring me up, and it was really hard, would bring me up and say, I thought it was just me. And I didn't feel that was good enough. The other thing is the patient preference dilemma. While we know that survivors are of all genders, perpetrators tend to be male. And so what that means is men and women survivors, and every gender in between, tend to come to female doctors. Now, again, and this is very common. If I've got something simple, I'll go to Dr. Michael, but when it's really complicated, I'll come to you. And again, not a problem, providing that it wasn't disincentivized. So what does that look like? Female GPs, 25% off. What I mean by that is that was the government's interpretation of that gender pay gap. When I did it on taxable income, it's 40% in Australia. Now, why? Let me explain Medicare. Oh, Lord. Okay, so here's our insurance system. In Australia, it's like your car. You get an insurance scheme. Everyone has Medicare, including you guys. If you ever came to visit me, we have arrangements with the UK. And let's imagine that your car broke down. You would, and it was, the mechanic charges you $1,000 to get your car repaired. And on your bill, you will have things like fixing the left bumper and replacing the back tyres. So a series of individual things that the mechanic did. And your insurance company might pay $600 and then you're out of pocket $400, right? So that's what happens with us with Medicare. The patient pays a certain fee, and it should be around $100 now, and they would get $40 back from Medicare. What we do with compassionate donation of time and labour is that we can accept the insurance part as total payment. So we will say to the patient, you're on a pension, you're homeless, you're elderly, you're a baby. We will just accept like that $40 as total payment. So in essence, we're giving them a 50% discount. It's not required, but it is the way that most of us would have done this. I'll come back to why it works. And we then put in whatever item numbers we can think of that add up together to try and get that rebate. So I might see a patient and I might take off a skin cancer and talk about their diabetes, and they're two different item numbers. Does that make sense? Yes. However, the problem with item numbers is non-procedural item numbers are worth less. Long consultations are worth less. Mental health consultations are worth less. And work outside of the consultation is not paid at all. So how does that impact someone like me? So the numbers are a little old, but you can see this is the Medicare rebate per minute. So there's an item number that covers less than 20 minutes. You can see the more I spent, the less per minute Medicare pays. This is a long consultation. This is a really long consultation. So when I do my sort of work, unlike my rapid throughput clinics who are bringing in $6 per minute, I'm bringing in $1.80. Now, why does that matter? Because if you bulk bill, that's all you get. Now, right now, because of the cost of living, it's not enough to keep the doors open. So women particularly are in this horrible position that in order to keep the doors open, they have to charge needy patients. And it's really being difficult. And it's the moral distress that they want to do that and they can't. And then they're being shamed for it that is driving women out of practice. And that is policy misogyny. Students at the back. Now, what does that look like? Okay, let's imagine this calendar. Here's Dr. Bob. And Dr. Bob's got all sorts of different consultations. Don't worry what they are. This might be an immunisation and maybe that's a standard consultation or whatever. Dr. Carroll, however, has almost all mental health with maybe a few at the top and a couple of women's health sort of consultations. And when I costed it up, here's the difference. And that's your 40% gender pay gap. Now, we could make it easier. We could say, okay, we're not going to undersell ourselves. We're going to charge the patients. But remember that self-sacrificial expectation? they spit at the staff. Because in the papers, our health minister says you should vote with your feet if your doctor doesn't bulk bill. You should go find someone who does because it's unethical. Our health minister who has frozen our rebates. It's an interesting perspective. Hence the reason why we're running into difficulty. The other thing the government did is freeze the rebates for 10 years. So while your cup of coffee kept going up, Medicare rebates didn't. Now that's the expectation of compassionate donation of time and labour, right? They go, well, the GPs are bulk billing anyway, because of course we do, because we're all, you know, we're in general practice because we love it. And they kept it going until we weren't. And even then, it's remained relatively frozen. Does that make sense? Yes. Now that is an example of policy misogyny. It's not deliberate, but it's systemic and it's often hidden. Now, I have a lovely colleague called Erin, and Erin and I swamps. Here we go. Here's a swamp. So where did the swamp come from? It's important. So there's this guy called Donald Shawn. He was actually an architect, and he said it doesn't matter what profession you're in. It doesn't matter if it's engineering or medicine. There's always a high, hard ground overlooking a swamp. And in the high, hard ground, you get straightforward, not easy, but straightforward problems that lend themselves well to technical solutions. But it's down in the swamp where you have the problems of greatest human concern. So Erin is an artist. She's a science communication artist. And she and I did several articles together about the swamp. And one of the things we did that sticks is this idea of swamp crocodiles. So every time the government brings in more data management strategies, more administration, more everything else, it makes shepherding people through the swamp of general practice harder. It also hurts them and it hurts us because patients don't. Patients sometimes, to give you an example, I had a father and a son coming to see me, both homeless. And I said to the son, did you get a pension? And he went, oh God, no, I went into Centrelink and they made me use a computer and I don't know how to use a computer. So I left. I said to Dad, what about you? And he said, well, I tried. They gave me this 23 pages of documents. Oh, I can't read that. So I threw it away. And I said, well, how do you support yourselves? And he went, well, we beg. Now that's digital poverty. And we deal a lot in general practice with digital poverty and digital literacy, people who cannot find their way through the systems. And how many times have we heard the new IT system is going to streamline things, and give people options and make things easier? Yes, it does, providing you can read. So this is why I always visualise paperwork and politics crocodiles. And it's actually been quite a helpful narrative to get the story across, hence the way I'm talking to you about storytelling. We also know that you can't charge Medicare if the patient isn't in the room. And we're now looking at $1 billion in unpaid labour in general practice, 10 hours per week for women, 6 hours per week for men. That time is, again, the compassionate donation of time and labour. And it's getting more and more difficult as we're getting more and more regulated. But what happens in terms of evidence? Because we also have misogyny in our evidence. So let's walk you through that. And these are some things I never knew until I started doing this work. First is, did you know that every rat in a scientific experiment, unless it's about pregnancy, is male? I didn't, but they are. And they're white. They're probably urban. They might not be. So, urban rats. See, when I say urban in Australia, it really matters because if you're rural, you could be 1,000 kilometres away from a major city. So that's a huge barrier, yeah? So the ideal rat in every scientific experiment that has ever been in medicine is a boy, unless they're looking at pregnancy. This is one of the people, I have 6 people in the country I won't work with. This comes from one of them, and it's the annual report. And I took all the pictures I could find about this research institute, and I think you can probably get a sense of the bias that comes through in terms of research. Money tends to follow the blokes. It's really fierce in Australia. I don't know what it's like here. Now, here's the grants. The only 2 people who got awards for their special research were looking at midwifery, women's testosterone, and donor milk. The rest, so women's things get money for women, but very rarely do we find them turning up in terms of grant money. And then we get the participants in the trials. You won't know this bloke, but I do. His name is Norm. So there was a big public health thing when I was young, which is a long time ago, called Life Be In It. And Norm was your, what we call a couch potato. He just hung around and sat there. And his wife was constantly coming up to him and saying, come on, Norm, life be in it. Up you get. And trying to get him to walk or drink less beer or whatever it was. Went around for years. And actually it was quite ahead of its time because you can see the faded people. There was actually quite a lot of diversity. However, in trials, there is not a lot of diversity. You have to get there. You have to be able to afford the transport. You have to have only one thing at a time. You're not allowed to have chronic illness with complex things. You have to turn up on time. All of those things mean that we have less participants with disprivilege around the world. It's not just here. And we look at them all as people of one disease. And so we tend to get a cohort of participants that look very much like Norm. We do get women, but they tend to be fairly narrow. Now, the other thing that happens is that evidence then gets formed into algorithms. So this is a platform that was created by a particular person. Don't worry what it means, but what it is, look, you can move certain criteria and these things will turn around to show you how much good impact you're going to have on the health system. What's it based on? It's based on all that research. What's the research? It's all biased. And so algorithms tend to magnify the bias. Now, what that happens then is you end up with quality indicators that are based on the research that is biased. And so people who work with this community end up having a worse quality of care than people who work with that one. So you end up thinking that people in room X who are doing the work with the more straightforward people, and we are finding in Australia now that a number of these patients can't get signed on to a lot of the services. The services are saying, look, we don't think we're right for you. Why? Well, because they take a heck of a hit looking after them, which is terrible because they have the worst of the illness. Now, then let's magnify that with AI. What's AI based on? The algorithms. What are the algorithms based on? And so we end up with this lovely article called Augmenting Inequality, the BMJ. I didn't tell you why diversity. The reason diversity is there was an Aussie researcher who worked out that people called David had more chance of getting grants than women. So it's a common phrase. It was a while ago, but it's a common phrase we use about diversity. That's where it comes in from. So you can see that we will not only have discriminatory data, but there's already health inequalities, there's already application injustices about the way people get access to care, and then who runs the AI? And we're back to where we started. So it's a big concern to me, particularly about what's going to happen. The trouble is, as I said, we end up with little gated communities where only good people with one disease and simplicity who can turn up on time get access to care. And what it feels like in the swamp is there's these little gated communities and then I've got to swim further to get around them. And I've got less resources because they've been captured by services that are evidence-based and get good outcomes, both of which are biased. Yeah? So this is where we run into troubles with the public health question. Now, what about outcome-based funding? It's supposed to be a good thing. And we hear about it all the time from economists. The same issue. If we take everybody down the tree, then research outputs are more relevant for privileged populations. What does that do? You end up with relevant evidence for certain people leading to better outcomes, but then I end up using that evidence to people who were never in the population in the first place. They actually get worse. And that's what's happened with cardiac disease, because women don't have cardiac disease the way men have cardiac disease. They refuse to give me the symptoms I was taught, which is really frustrating because they die. because they don't get left-sided chest pain going down the arm and up to the jaw that we were taught. And we were taught that because the original Framingham study had no women in it at all. So often we'll go keep this out of place.
What's that? You're away. You're away.
Hello. So the weird thing about general practice is we have this paradox. We do worse on single diseases, but we do better for patients. We get greater equity, lower cost, better quality of care, but we refuse to get their markers down. There was a famous story in England where they decided they were going to pay for performance. And one of the things they paid for was getting someone's blood pressure down. What happened? We had a rise in fractured hips because all the old people had their blood pressure dropped and fell over. So, you know, it's really hard to explain to a government that things can have unintended consequences. And this is an absolute classic, this one. I have a lot of trouble with this, and this is the swamp version of trying to tell that story. And often what I'll say is if clinical practice could be reduced to a set of algorithms, and what I usually say to government is it wouldn't take 11 years to train me, you know, and if we keep enshrining interventions by calling it evidence-based, then we're in trouble. And the way I would explain that is sometimes using this idea of these robots, swamp robots, which is often I use it for mental health initiatives that are online because they're just metastasizing in my world. There's thousands of them. And they only work for first episode, which is pretty rare, one disease, which is pretty rare, people who can read. And actually, just so you know, I did the reading age of all of them and none of them had a lower reading age than Dickens. And that was good for me because it let me publish a paper called Great Expectations in E-Mental Health. That I thought was good. I wish I'd thought of it for someone else in the team. So this is another narrative, talking about narratives. This is again Erin's lovely work. So let's imagine that we create a co-designed, patient-centred, evidence-based scooter on the top of the mountain, and we explain that that works really well to get patients around the system. It does. There's been a lot of evidence. What often happens for us is that they'll toss the scooter into the swamp, telling us that it's evidence-based, and of course it doesn't work. The hard bit is then what our government tends to do is to incentivise or require GPs to use them. And we say it doesn't work. And then they say, well, that's a matter of education. Maybe you don't know how to use a scooter. So we'll put some compulsory education into the training program to help you with scooter work. And that's what's happened with digital mental health initiatives, that the framework for that has been written by people who own shares in companies and designed digital mental health and work on boards. And now it says that we are required to put digital mental health services, quote, in the centre of our care. Not a chance. Most of my patients can't read them, let alone have a device to use. And only 2%, with all the advertising we've done, 2% of Australians have ever opened one. But nevertheless, there's evidence, isn't there? So once you walk away from here, one of the things I want you to think about is, are we getting to a post-evidence world? Are we now getting to a world where people use the word evidence-based like an approving bumper sticker on something that they want without actually having the scientific evidence? Now, don't get me wrong, if I had chemotherapy, I'd want the trials, you know, because my human physical body is probably fairly similar to everybody else's human physical body with cancer. But my mental health, not a chance. And so this model of simple science is getting leveraged in a way. And for me, it's like, you know, light milk or sugar-free yogurt or all natural, you know. It's being often used in a non-evidence-based way. So keep critical because you have to be. So I want to show you a little bit about my world. I live in the ACT, that's a state. Now, in Australia, the GPs are funded by the country, by the feds, federal government, and hospitals by the states. So you can imagine how much arguing goes on. I wanted to talk to you about my state because my state has the worst anti-doctor narrative I have ever heard. We have a health minister who is determined to work out ways to replace doctors as much as possible. You see, this is a blobfish. Anyone know about blobfish? Blobfish are cool. They live at the bottom of the ocean. They're not that ugly, actually, at the bottom of the ocean because they're not subject to pressure. So they're actually quite normal looking. It's only when you bring them to the surface, okay, there's another narrative story, isn't there? In their habitat, they're quite attractive. When you bring them into the government sort of pressure, they start looking like that. Now, blobfish live on this stuff called ocean dandruff. Isn't that called ocean dandruff? So they live on the stuff that filters down that no one else wants from the top of edges of the ocean. And at the moment, their habitat is endangered, partly because there's too much ocean dandruff. Now, for us, we're in the same position because a lot of things are being discharged or not brought into hospital because there's no hospital space. But the dandruff is the trauma. So people are almost getting, sent home to deliver their own placenta in the taxi almost. And what that means is all of that I've got. I've got the people who don't understand what was explained to them in 5 seconds as everyone wandered past because the hospitals are full. I've got the people who are traumatised by spending 8 hours in an ambulance and not getting into ED and thinking they were going to die. All of that dandruff is now being managed by me. But this is very much what our health minister thinks we are. And you think I'm kidding, you think I'm being paranoid, let me explain a few things. Okay, so there's a few narratives that she drives and are driven around our country. Doctors are lousy communicators, therefore it would be better to get nice people like nursing and allied health to replace them because doctors are patriarchs and we don't give people the right of reply, we just tell them what to do. Actually, our evidence says no. So here's our evidence. We're looking 91 to 94% of patients say that we listen carefully and show respect, and it doesn't seem to matter that much. Remember that these guys are probably more busy and they've got 6-minute drivers. So who's responsible if we don't listen and show respect? We're incentivising 6-minute consults. Makes it hard. Yeah. The other one, we should be replaced by nurses. We hear this all the time. Doctors are seen very much in Australia as male. I don't know why, because GPs are predominantly female, but that patriarchal narrative keeps coming back and back and back, even though most of the blokes I work with don't use it either, nevertheless. But here we are, we've got almost identical scores, except perhaps for country nurses who are pretty awesome. But other than them, we're running pretty similarly. We're the blue line. And actually we do much better than ED nurses. I think you call them A&E nurses. But still, it's Florence Nightingale versus, Howard Shipman in there. We also get this problem where it's expensive. Now, this is mental health because it's the argument I often have to make. And I've tried all sorts of ways, and this is the one that seems to make the difference. On the left here, you have how many patients we see in a year. Now, one of the psychiatrists has published that GPs, all they are glorified referrers. And we've been told that many, many, many times. So we need to make this. And this is a pile of money over there is how many millions we actually spend. And if you look at the rest of the system, we're cheap and we see more people. And it's taken me a long time to craft the response. When in a meeting I'm told that I should do things a certain way, but I've now learned to say, Professor Psychiatrist person, you are not the expert in the patients you refuse to see. Most of my patients will not be seen by psychiatry. They won't get into the hospitals and they can't afford private. So the majority of my patients see no one but me, ditto with everybody else. So sometimes you've got to get into the data and tell a story, and that particular shape has been incredibly helpful. This is the graph. So I had 10 minutes in a forum to present a whole lot of things. It took me 6 months to write all the slides because you've got to be really tight. The shorter the presentation, the more preparation. So The health minister's in the audience, and she's forever said that we are expensive and we're greedy and fraudulent and we overcharge. So this one was really important. The green is what Medicare pays, the blue is what the patient pays. And I think this slide is per service. It's $16 per year per patient. They are out of pocket. It's cheap. She tried to disagree with this one, but it didn't work because I had the numbers. You've got to have the numbers. If you don't have the numbers, you go wrong. But that didn't really work. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to the media. Let's look at the narratives that are being shown about doctors. And you can see that the last time I saw a positive story about doctors in Australia was probably the Thai cave rescue, which was about 6 years ago. We had an extraordinary misuse of data. So a woman did a PhD. She now has a business teaching people to use Medicare. And she published lots of media saying that doctors were defrauding the government of $8 billion a year in frauds. It took off hugely. And a lot of this comes from that. And the story was she interviewed 18 people, of which 12 used Medicare, and asked, how much do you reckon is mischarged? Now, Medicare is really complicated. So sometimes we make mistakes because it's about this thick and it's really hard. And they went, oh, about a third. That's where the $8 billion came from. In response to that, the government looked into it, found out it was nonsense, and then built a compliance department with 10 public servants to look into it. It's interesting the way these stories roll. But that didn't really work either. So what I did was I thought, look, it's not going to work unless it's personal. So what I did is I went to the ACT Health site and I extracted absolutely everything they had said in the last 24 months. And that was 12 months, 430,000 words, not pleasant. AI, please, work in emojis. And I extracted all the describing words and did some analysis. Before I talk about that, just to give you an example, this is World Pharmacist Day, all the advertisements. The guy second from the right is our highly forgettable Prime Minister. Every single minister in the country made a video for the pharmacists. This is nurses and this is doctors. No. So there's been a whole lot of cumulative reasons why things have been particularly hard. But I want to show you something. So here I am, 430,000 words, everything they said. So documents, Hansards, articles in the paper, media releases, websites, reports, anything I can find. And I look for the adjectives about each profession. And the green ones are the good ones, and the orange ones are the yeah, and the red ones are not very nice. There was a report about the fact that we're not very good in disability. That's true. So there's nurses. Now, pharmacy was interesting because pharmacy, as you can see, has a communication strategy. How do I know this? There's very few words and they use them all the time. Yeah. However, this is GPs. That framing made a huge difference because it enabled me to say, no, Minister, these are your words. These are the words of people in your department. This is what they are saying. And it's made more difference than any evidence. I've got the evidence that GPs keep people out of hospital. I've got the evidence that GPs mean that people don't die. I've got evidence to burn, but it wasn't until we got to this. And I could see her fishing around for something to say, and she really didn't have anywhere to move. Now, this is just as biased as the quantitative stuff, but it looks better, you know. And if you ask me, I'll tell you what the methodology is, but nevertheless, it was necessary because we had to get past her prejudice. She would not see her systemic bias. I don't know if it'll make any difference, but it made more difference than any of the graphs we had. And what impact is it having? It's having more impact on the women. So this is the national numbers of women retiring. That's ACT. A lot more women in ACT. Now, the argument is why, and I reckon it probably hits me a bit harder than my male colleagues. I don't know why. I think I talk more about this nonsense than they do, and maybe, I don't know. But anyway, ACT GPs are leaving in droves. But also look at this. So this is discrimination, harassment and sexism. And remember in Australia, racism. In Australia, we do a trainee survey every year. So ACT and National are running pretty similar, right? But who is responsible? Medical colleagues, pretty much the same. These are proportions. But I wanted to show you this. So these are the nurses. And what's interesting is that ACT GP trainees have twice as much bullying, harassment and discrimination from nurses than National. And I think that's modelling. So my Minister for Health employs all nurses in the state, plus anything to do with hospitals. It gets harder though when you look at this. So this is patients. So this is what happens when you start having revolting media. And we needed to do this to show you are actually having an impact on the workforce. They won't care about us as individuals, but they will care about the fact that we leave. So again, talking about how you use narratives to try and make a point. Sometimes you've got to fish around the water. So I wanted to talk about, this is one of my favourite cartoons. And we have a lot of wellbeing policy and performative wellbeing like everyone does. And this for the NHS. But it's so true for us. There's a little bit of nod to wellbeing, but not engaging deeply in it. So I want to just do these last minutes to talk about this project that Ros and I are doing on sexual harassment, just to show you some things that are impacting women differently and how we have, you know, different problems. Now, those things I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about prevalence because if I do, everyone is about whether it's 31 or 32%. It's more than zero. If you want prevalence statistics, but everywhere I go, I get this, everywhere. I haven't experienced it. I haven't seen it. No one's told me about it. It's really a problem. And every single time I've got to have an answer before people will be prepared to hear me. So I will get, do you think it's just that they're not as resilient as they need to be? Do you think it's that they're all wearing short skirts? Do you think they need to toughen up a bit? I've been doing this for a long time. If they don't report, what am I supposed to do? But what about the men? And it doesn't matter if I never use the word women in the whole thing, I still get, but what about the men? Which, you know, is slightly frustrating because in our book, the reviews all said that, and the third chapter is the role of men, which is, you know, so frustrating. And it shows you how powerful narratives actually are. I want to have a brief word on resilience. I have a daughter who's a historian and she's great with metaphors. And I was complaining to her, she was complaining back, how resilience gets weaponised. Oh, you just got to be more resilient, you know. And she said, you know, everyone talks about resilience being the bounciness of a ball, but the ability of a ball to bounce is a function of the ball and the surface, because no ball's going to bounce in a swamp. And later on, we decided that it doesn't even matter if the Labrador's gorgeous. The ball's never going to bounce again. Sometimes it's someone outside of you and the environment. And it's really hard when it's a nice person. Because when it's a nice person, it's crazy making. And this is often what's happening in sexual harassment, racism space. But keep in mind the dog ball and surface will come up later. Ros and I also have this thing about narratives, you know. I don't want to hear about sensitive snowflakes. It's just not women and it's not bad apples. Because that's a way of sidestepping the narrative that everyone is responsible. And we get it all the time. Oh, he's just one bad apple. Every other person is awesome. Or, oh, she's a bit oversensitive. Drives us nuts. So we were trying to work out, well, why is it hard for survivors to speak? And you can talk about the barriers from a upfront point of view, like, you know, they might lose their training, that sort of thing. But there's some unconscious problems that really come in. There's a real cognitive dissonance. Stories we tell are not the right stories. They're happening in a hospital, not a dark alley. That's rapeness. We have to get around them. We've got hierarchies. I'm just a trainee, he's the senior surgeon. Yeah. And you can have all these slides, I'll hand them over. But this was the interesting one. That when you're a trainee, it's like being in an abusive relationship. You've got the same boundary problems, like expecting someone to come in all weekend when they're not paid. It's a weird, says this person, parental, patriarchal kind of relationship. And the other thing is that we teach, particularly women, you're not allowed to be silly, hysterical, or not cut out for medicine. You've got to be tough, but you've also got to be nice. Can't not be nice, because if you're not nice, you're not a good doctor. But you also can't be hysterical. So it's a really difficult space for women to walk. I just wanted to talk quickly about role conflicts. And this is about talking about the doll, right? The people around the circumstance. All these people could make a difference, but we've got role conflicts that are deeper than personally. You might have a mentor who's a great mentor and teaches you a lot and invites you around for a family barbecue. A horrible surgeon might invite you around for a family barbecue and then sexually harass you. So the question is, how close is close enough to be a good mentor without putting people at risk of grooming? When you get to managers, it's going to sack the senior surgeon over the intern. When you get to spokespeople, who talks? There's been some horrible media about survivors, one of which says, if you've got a brain tumour, you can blame Carolyn Tan, who's one of the famous survivors in our world, because she ruined the senior surgeons. Awful. Happens all the time. We get witnesses, because you know what? These survivors stay in the same team, so you get split teams. Whose side do you want? Who are you going to support? Educators, with the best will in the world, we've got to use subjective measurements. And what happens when subjective measurements happen is if you don't do what the senior surgeon wants, maybe you just don't pass the interpersonal communications list of things or the teamwork list. And that tends to be what happens. Advocates, how do we ensure justice and fairness when we know our legal system isn't just and fair? And colleagues, when do we become whistleblowers when we know that whistleblowers get harmed? The dilemma that started it all for me was therapy, which was, if I'm a doctor, he's a doctor and she's a doctor, is it good for me to be the therapist or not? How does that fit? We often have simple solutions to complex problems. We have the compulsory module on how to be a decent human being. We have all sorts of things that never work because no one ever gets into this stuff. I just wanted to go towards the end and just say that when we're in a post-evidence world, we have to use different skills. And here's an example. When I teach medical students, I will usually say there are 4 types of therapeutic relationship. There's the parentalist one, which they say, oh, that's bad. And I go, no, if I'm unconscious, please don't wake me up and have a conversation about my preferred anaesthetic. Just do it. You know, sometimes you have to be the doctor and just do it. And that's appropriate. There's partnership, which is the majority where you're working together. And there's consumerist. You might come into me and say, look, I don't need to waste your time, doctor. Could you just give me a flu vaccine? I don't have to partner with you for that. I just have to give you what you need. And then psychotherapeutic is the 2 of you exploring to try and discover something that neither of you know. But we're finding more and more that there's this concept called comradeship, where it's you and I against the state. It's the time I say to patients, you've got a headache, haven't you? Because if you don't have a headache, I can't order an MRI scan. But I think you've got a headache. Of course, they need an MRI scan. They've got multiple sclerosis. They've got to find the darn thing and they can't afford not to. And so if you push a GP far enough, they will comrade. That's what they do. We're all rednecks. We talk a lot about vicarious trauma, which is the trauma I experience being exposed to people's stories. We don't talk about vicarious resilience, what I learn from patients and how that strengthens me. And we don't talk about vicarious resistance, which is both of us working together to push back against what we think is wrong. And the people who wrote this article, and I will circulate anything you like, our findings point to an internal fracture point, and when doctors start to behave badly, when trauma-informed care meets neoliberal service systems, we won't do it. And women particularly tend to get to those fracture points. because they're the rare spaces. And if they do that too much, they burn out, and that's what's happening. So just to finish, I wanted to say this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is, you know, if you haven't got a roof over your head and food on the table, then there's no point in giving you CBTs. But it's evidence-based. So remember, whenever you're looking at a circumstance, for me, it's always about finding out what I can do for the ball, finding out what I can do for the surface, and finding out whether I need to do something about the dog, even if the dog is nice, because they're the ones that are really confusing. Now, I have put in some QR codes if you want them. So that one takes you to my page on women's health, and this one takes you to the, well, this one takes you to the donation page, I'm sorry, but because we're trying to make the book open access, and £1,000. Oh my Lord, which I can't get out of my books. But if you email me, I will send you, and there is the URL to go to find out more about the book that isn't involved in donation. Sorry, I forgot that was the wrong one. So you can go there, or you can email me. Just Google me, Louise Stone, you'll find an email address. I'm pretty hopeless about keeping things private. Thank you very much, and you're welcome to ask me anything. Students. Does any student want to ask me a question? I've already got a soft spot. I was a bit meek when I was a student, believe it or not. Yeah.
Thank you very much for very fascinating and important presentation. I was wondering, part of that seems to be economic issues. There not be any economists in the room. And some of these things remind me of, you know, like how that? Like, I don't know, like think about housework not being recognized in the 60s. I don't know exactly when that was. And then kind of women and others keeping up, like recognizing this work. Do you think there's any way of translating this to this, like women on strike or something like that? Our pages is one of them, right? Given a strategy.
Absolutely. So one of the strategies we use in general practice is we're advocating for, you know, it shouldn't matter if I'm doing 6 minutes or 40 minutes. The economists are all really old and all male and they have this idea, which just blows my mind, that if they paid me the same to do 40 minutes that I could do in 6, I'd just sit around chatting. Yes, nonsense. The ED doctors don't sit around chatting, and they're on a salary. So it doesn't make any sense. So you have to find the point that the person will hear. So for the economists, that's where is the evidence that a doctor like an orthopaedic surgeon or an ED doctor or whoever is on a salary is less efficient than someone like me who's optimised for 6 minutes? And where is the evidence to suggest that 6 minutes is what patients want? Well, it isn't, you know. So you've got to find the argument for the person. So that's the financial argument. Yeah. The Deputy Federal Health Minister is a female nurse who's saying that medical misogyny is awful, which is the idea that women get worse care. It's true, it is awful. Every single narrative she runs is, Jane went to see insert awful doctor. Awful doctor dismissed her and gaslit her and didn't listen. And then she found nurse Susan, and Susan fixed it all. And so we've called her out on that because we said we're sure that's not what she meant. But you know. So I think you have to use horses for courses. And the other thing for those of you who want to get into advocacy, you've got to work out what you're good at. So I'm not great politically. I'm good politically, but I'm not good around the table. So I just make the bullets and pass them on to people who do. So you work in teams. So the president of the College of GPs and the president of the College of Rural and Remote Medicine will get me giving them policy documents, which they then leverage. Because I don't care. I don't need my name up there. But you find out what you're good at, and one of the things I'm good at is writing, and I'm also good at designing narratives. And so I tend to sort of share those across, and then they can get used by the people who are in power. So it's a different sort of way of it. And there are some beautiful male advocates who've done all sorts of interesting things when they won't listen to me. So in a meeting, often I'll be mansplained to by the doctors and the nurses will say I'm a patriarch, and it shuts me down both sides. And I do have some wonderful male colleagues who will say, you need to talk to Louise about that. She's the expert, not me. I tell you what, those champions are awesome. And there's a lot of them, and they are extraordinary because what they do is call it out. And I'm very fortunate to have dozens of awesome people of all genders who will champion the voice that needs to be heard, not just mine, but people with even more intersectional disprivilege. So it's all very well for me. I'm white and I speak English well. Some of my colleagues, you know, don't have those opportunities. It's all about sharing it around and doing it deliberately. Anyone else? Yeah.
Louise, thank you. That was really fantastic. And just to make a comment, I love the expression post-evidence world. It seems very obvious, but I think it's hugely important. So you said something like, quoting from a paper by Frank Corrigan about psychiatry, there's an evidence base, but there's no evidence. What does that mean? The evidence base is out there, but how we use it is hugely important.
Yes.
And it becomes very dichotomized often. There is evidence or there isn't, but we have to, of course, we can say it's effective, but it has to apply to the truth which the evidence refers.
Yes.
And we often just forget that completely. We can try and discuss that. And I'm talking about the shocking events. You are stonewall because the complexity of including the patient group of doctors.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's a difficult space. I'm going to have to finish up, but one last question.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you find that age is another variable? Just the idea of misogyny within younger women in the medical field versus older women versus middle-aged women, or just
No, they're the hysterical teenager, and then they become the, you know, the over-anxious young mother, and then you morph into me, who's a neurotic middle-aged woman who wants to get out more, to the anxious little old lady, unfortunately. I think all ages and stages struggle. I wish they didn't. And yeah, I do teach people how to get around those things, my patients, because it is hard. Thank you. I'm just glad I was. Oh, okay. Questions online? Yes. Yes.
Interested in the comradeship of the is playing out in China.
Yes, and the answer to that is that yes, comradeship is used more often. In that we do have to work a lot harder in health inequalities because of the, you know, the Julian Tudor heart problem that the people with the most disprivilege get the least services, and that also plays into the comment earlier that the government would really like medicine to all work like cataracts. You can't see, you have a cataract, you do an evidence-based thing and it's all better. And it tries to shove everything in there as though all of medicine is that nice little positivist problem, and it isn't. So those patients tend to miss out. And with the second comment, women choose emotionally intensive. No, this is not necessarily true. In that often the community chooses the women, not the women choosing the problem. So women will often, people with complexities will choose a lady doctor. And it doesn't matter if you're a physician or a surgeon. But I will say that those who survive in surgery do tend to align themselves with a male way of doing. And that becomes problematic. So it's 2% in neurosurgery of women. 50% of doctor graduates are women. So it's extremely low. And there's a whole lot of benevolent sexism. So hostile sexism is much easier. It's when someone says, I'm not going to see you, you're a woman, you know, women don't know what they're doing. That's easy. It's when they're, do you think maybe, you know, you might be better at things that are family friendly? From the nice person, that's the harder one. And I reckon that's got a lot to do with surgery. Yeah.
Like when you're doing comradeship as an approach, are you getting pushback because if you're
Oh, yeah.
constantly getting like compliance, do you get penalized for it? And like,
Oh, yeah. So the classic would be. Have I got time? Is that right? I was in a country town. I had a pregnant woman I was looking after. She had the worst postnatal depression I've ever seen in her first pregnancy, and actually had electroconvulsive shock therapy for 2 years. It was awful. Unexpectedly fell pregnant again. And I put her in my tiny little 15-bed hospital, and she became psychotic. The obstetricians wouldn't take her in my local hospital because she had a psychiatric problem. The psychiatrist wouldn't take her in my local hospital because she had an obstetric problem. I tried the big St Elsewhere's, you know, in Melbourne, the big fancy hospital, and they all didn't do it. And so eventually, this is when I learned how to tell stories. I told the infectious diseases registrar that she was a farmer and she had a headache, she did, and she was delusional, she was, and pregnant, and she had an unvaccinated herd for leptospirosis, which causes that, which was all true, just wasn't the problem. And so when she got to Melbourne, she was in hospital for 3 months, and they wrote back to me a very patronising letter that said, actually, she was depressed. And I went, really? Let's get good at it. Thank you all so much. Hello online.